Hello everyone, today we talk about the integration of the Humiliati in the Catholic Church at the beginning of the 13th century, one of the most important accomplishments, in fact, of the Papal monarchy in the integration of the broader evangelical and pauperistic movements. These are the same years in which effectively the Mendicant orders are established, affirmed, and let's say the background of these groups was pretty much the same. There was a Christomimic, in fact, pauperistic instance, right, of protest towards the church, or how the way it had been structuring itself. The Humiliati were, in particular, quite similar to the Waldensians. Of that group, I actually made a video about both the Humiliati and the Waldensians. We talked also about Arnold of Brescia, all the broader political implications of these movements in the 12th and 13th century. And it's a universe on its own, right? Exemplifying, however, dynamics that are somehow similar to others in history, even to today at an ideological level. We will digress on them as we list them now, given that you cannot really distinguish the theological, the doctrinal, the traditional belief with the political, even the military and the social instances of these groups that, as you know, had been emerging, especially among the urban population, especially the textile workers. The Humiliati fundamentally were also a Lombard movement. They spread within this social background, and they had some important, in fact, anti-hierarchy, anti-institutional instances brewing. And one of the problems with these movements that today I will not even say focus on, even as far as the Humiliati are concerned, because this is exactly the point, are not dramatically documented. It's not much just about the fact that the church eventually managed to integrate them by modifying, or at least normalizing their beliefs on an orthodox axis, but they were really broader movements that you couldn't quite simply frame within a specific context only, right? At least there were many facets of this. There were different intersections also with other groups that instead remained out, and this is in fact what happened to the Humiliati themselves. You know that there were heretical currents even within the Franciscan order, right? We talked about the Joachimites, made a video specifically on this. At a point there, the church really had to make a massive, canceling of a lot of the documents also that had showed how these groups had been integrated in the church and had fundamentally kept cultivating part of their heretical beliefs. This was a purge, let's say, that struck in the Papal Curia, in the Theological Studium of Paris, and that left an important mark, right? We are at the end, in that case, of the 13th century. The Humiliati were more obedient, and this is, in fact, the point. What we are discussing them generally today, because they are the ones that, after all, even though having, again, their own heretical fringes, were able to separate themselves from the latter and accepting the orthodox doctrine of the Roman Church. And as I was saying, they serve a bit the purpose of exemplifying the broader accomplishment that the papacy achieved in these very centuries, in generations that had seen a moment of crisis, right, within Christendom, right before the pontificate about Innocent III that I discussed in multiple ways. We will have, of course, to talk about, had really seen a comeback of Islamic power. The last waves of Berbers, for example, from Morocco had hit again in the Iberian Peninsula. They had been able to defeat at some point the Christian armies that had been, as you know, ruinously defeated in Palestine at the Battle of Atin, right, at the hands of Saladin, the heretical movements were rampant within the same West, and it seemed at some point that there could be a broader ramification of such spread to a truly political, secular dimension. The Cathars in southern France had literally copied the entire Catholic hierarchy, including the instrument of the Inquisition, for example. And this is an aspect that is ever, say, misunderstood, right? Of course, we have come to the point in which, sadly, we can't say that on YouTube you can find reliable material in these things, because actually most people that call attention to these topics are, yes, first of all, saying whatever, this at least more often than not, that of course, oh, look at the terrible repression, still the dark idea of the Middle Ages and so on. They do not nail at all the point of what was going on at the time. But even when there is some sort of, look, this, heretics at large were some actually very dangerous, crazy, violent individuals, at least in some fringes, that were colluded with some actual secular powers that were actually Catholic in many ways, because most of these movements were not really, in fact, even claiming to come outside of the church. Actually, Rome was for all these, like the only point of reference was about what the church, the Roman Church, had to be, specifically how it had to be ordained, but it wasn't much about, say, contesting the figure of the papal monarchy per se. That, on the contrary, did contribute even to the organization just by, say, ecclesiastical mirroring, say, imitation of the same Roman Church. So this is gotten very wrong at so many levels. The Valdensians, for example, were completely supportive, in spite of being persecuted by the Roman Church, with the extermination of the Cathars, right? And there is a very specific reason, because behind those doctrines you find of course, it's not that it's an anti-Catholic doctrine in the sense of anti-papal per se, but it's anti-Catholic in the sense that any imperial tradition had existed, and any civilization fundamentally that had been ruling Europe from Indo-European times was exclusively based, since pagan times, on Catholicism, for what it actually means, right? If I meet a person on the street and say, what is Catholic? They think just, it's the Pope, right? It is not just that. It is something that even if it has never been explained to you as far as the ultimate purpose, we say, of earthly polities, not just the church. And what is the church anyway? There, if you ask, it would be quite interesting answers, or pretty empty ones, telling the truth. But those times were something else entirely, and the sense of crisis, the sense of civilizational threat, the fact that, for example, the church had won the investiture struggle in the 12th century, but at the beginning of it, and throughout the same, had to hurry up in order to, in fact, match the heretical movements, because there was no other, say, instrument of control before this time, right? And until Innocent III, still a lot had to be accomplished in the first place. Victories like Las Navas, or the ones against the Cathars, or the same Fourth Crusade was not, say, was a sort of offspin that, came out of hand, but that actually brought an incredibly positive result to Roman Catholicism, are all things that, together also with other accomplishments in the Holy Land, you can attribute to this massive, universal, in fact imperial character of the papacy, and of an enormous amount of wealth that was invested in order to actually save Christendom and Western civilization in that specific context, right? You cannot have something like, a parallel. So if you actually believe in universal values, you can't quite say, well, okay, there's going to be a parallel church that says that everything you think is wrong, and that, the body is the product of the devil, and so we should be vegans that, hate their own physicality. There is no such thing like, sex in the first place. These were actual ideologies that I made a very specific video explaining the nature of Catholicism. That's the title. That were disturbingly close to basically everything we're looking at today. And this is said by, say, I know that there is this thing for which people seem to have become blind to the sense that there is an objective truth as opposed to subjective feelings. And this is part of the very problem I'm highlighting, but that anything that a person says out here just regarding that must be, if it is against whichever ideology, it must be true that you belong to the opposite, and so that you're biased, and so your argument is invalid, right? But say, this is not my problem to solve for you. I just tell you what it's firmly established historiographically, and I don't even need to, say, prove you that I have an authority on this topic by providing you with the sources. That's actually one of the dumbest things you can do, because history, at the end of the day, is always a matter of authority. There is no such thing like a hard fact that you can simply, use as, especially more in scholarship or with studying ideologies. That's something you must understand. If you can't understand that, if you've never heard of that, if you're not aware what is written on it, it's your problem. I'm not going to make the favor to you, right? I'm just going to highlight the inadequacy, and that's where it's going to remain. But in any case, this is even more relatable, because in the dynamics that you see at the time, you see the same ones you see today. There is not a neatly separable difference, say, between say, left and right, just per se. There are certain, say, issues around which people revolve, thinking to belong to a group, but then simultaneously owning beliefs that actually belong to, if anything, the same level of degeneration of the masses, social inferiority, essentially cultural illiteracy, and they do not actually, it shouldn't be counterposed just on an horizontal level, but mostly looking at what is that it's actually getting civilizationally, which develops instead in a vertical way. This is exactly what the Roman Church achieved instead at the time by disciplining these groups and fundamentally saving the unity of the Church and establishing, in fact, during the 13th and 14th century, that, so as far as the Catholicism, that ancien regime that eventually lasted in spite of the Reformation, etc., but founding the Catholic Church in a way we know, aside from, the changes of especially the last couple of 100 years, but that's a problem that the entire world underwent, right? So you can't expect, of course, the Church to be, some sort of thing going just by itself. There are humans around it, that's another issue. So the framing, the integration of the ecclesiastical body of the Humiliati was a relevant fact, right? Humiliati means humiliated, of course, and this was the Latin name, it with H in front of that. And why was it relevant? Because basically, there were many groups negotiating with the Church in this regard. And again, I'm not going to digress on the fact that some of them were anti-hierarchical, they had essentially elite connotations. They were stemming, again, from the poorest and also from the more violent, the least educated, at least also theologically literate groups of the population. Of course, there were some powerful leaders who could use them against the establishment to, in some cases, even becoming part of it. Say, or here there is all the Guelph-Ghibelline struggle that would develop. We've seen it also in a ferocious way at the time of the Joachimites, with different swings depending on which, let's say, level you're playing, because you could be in favor, of course, of the Guelph cause, but you may want to have greater room within the same church. So this heterodoxy at some point was to be accepted simply because there is no way to control thought, right? People are somehow obsessed with this idea, in my opinion, as long as they want actually to go after certain ideologies. But thinking is free by definition. There is no such power owned by any culture, country, whatever, that can control people's mind. People simply just want that, right? And there is no way around it. It's just very often the weakness, the cowardice, the inferiority of the average person that is, pretty macroscopically and self-evident a reality. But it is a specific reason that is the same one you see today, a self-sabotaging of your own civilization in order to essentially not feel challenged about the fact that you are inferior to others, that are actually able to succeed and that manage to rule over you because they are better than you. And there is no other way around this, right? You can think that nobody's perfect, that there are people that do terrible things and still are in charge, but they're always going to pay for that. It's not about the person, it's about the office, right? They're going to pay for that because their in tradition, their physical, their moral condition is going to reflect that in the first place. And if you're not there yourself, it's objectively because you're not enough. You're not worth it, right? Because if you wanted that, you get there. And the entire, problem of Christianity, even in, why it had arisen, why did the empire and the church fundamentally split historically, as opposed to the original, coincidence, overlapping of, the secular rule and fundamentally the ecclesiastical one, is how far are you going to go morally in order to achieve essentially the transfiguration of the world that Christ, at least, triggered, as far as, this is a complex topic just because an interpretation is hardly ever put out there. It's not that evidently Christ solved all problems, because there is going to be in fact, eschatologically and messianically, struggle at the end time. There is we are called up for that, so it's still up to us, largely, right? And unless you're a Protestant, you think you don't have to do anything fundamentally about that. Well, welcome to the death of humanity, but in fact we're talking about the 13th century, not the 16th one. Aside from this, the point was relevant. Why, right? This movement was there anything good in this movement? Well, as large as they were, of course, they were catalyzing some social issues that, and even just individually legitimate questions, right? That the West, booming literally in the 12th to 13th century, was essentially posing itself after centuries of very different paradigms, right? For example, the availability of enormous amount of wealth was not much of a problem in itself, but that was triggering, again, because of social envy, these masses that did not understand why there would be, given a Christological example of relative poverty, some hierarchy of this kind, and this is how they mostly understood that, right? You can't generalize about these groups, because the same church at some point said, we put them down because this guy had armed lots of people, had begun to kill bishops, princes, whatever. Of course, the lay authorities were siding with the church, and that's most of the job, also in material military terms, of course, was carried out by them, but without the guidance of the church in a unitary monarchic profile, would have been quite different to accomplish it in the first place. All these are important issues that deserve other videos. We have already discussed. There's a medieval Christianity playlist. You can find lots of this. But the point, getting down also, to the positive side, what is that, in front of this enormous wealth that we had never seen practically, at least in a broader memory of how the world was run, and pre-industrial societies were always pretty miserable, right? It's not even that just during Roman times or, the same 13th century, the majority of people lived in particularly better ways than before. It was substantially the same, right? Just there was, in fact, a civilizational capacity of maintaining the order in ways that were much more effective, and yes, that made it to grant much higher standards of living for the time, right? So that the 13th century is one of the most, shockingly, divine moments in the history of mankind. There's no doubt about this, but the essence, of course, is still it's a human world, it's a fallen world, and lots of people do not quite have what they need, and they're going to wonder whether all the wealth that was being accumulated disproportionately, in some cases, was actually concentrated in the hands, of course, of those who have to rule, because otherwise, how could the system work, right? The system boomed exactly because there were fewer people that were better than the others enough to understand how to invest the stuff, how to manage, how to push. We've seen it in feudal Europe, many videos about the seigneurial system, how it was the feudal world that at least catalyzed this process, and that looser societies with somehow more scattered wealth had more often actually less than that, right? If you're underdeveloped, you're like that, and you actually live worse than even the average of what people live in this other relatively more imbalanced system. And first of all, and it's not stable at all. It doesn't work, right? There is, no way to start truly providing decent infrastructure, increasing population in coherent ways, settling, deforesting, claiming, etc. You need a true elite. You need a state. You need something that makes that work as a framework for your political insight. And the sense, however, that the reliance, just like we think today, on even technological improvement, material wealth, etc., could create, could deteriorate further the moral background of the world, seemed apparent to some degree. It's easy to say that reality is a mess. So welcome to the concept of original sin that essentially these heretical sects were responding to, it's really nobody's fault except that we have to believe that we had that improving, trying to improve our own condition and getting more power and coming closer to God in terms of world domination and his, greater power. That is, it's difficult, of course, to reach, to say the least, but that was at least the original traditional belief that all systems had maintained, because from the single freeman in a tribe at the fringe of the earth to the actual emperors at the center of the ecumenic empire, and that all had to be, destroying your own body, essentially killing yourself, and so, well, God will provide at that point, because there's just a monstrous demon of evil that is as powerful as God in matter, and so you cannot do anything with matter. It's better to just die in practice, and everything that everybody has in terms of wealth or of capacity or genetic quality or whatever, it has to be denied at every level, so that all civilization will fundamentally collapse before anything. You understand why these ideologies were spreading among the masses, because it's the same identical dynamic that you see today. So naturally, not all the heterodox movements were buying into that, right? Some had legitimate theological concerns. They had some, of course, insight of the fact that, yes, as also the Gospels are very clear about, but the entire biblical tradition, but not just that one in general, of course, there is, if you are distracted by something earthly that you must cope with, that's your thing, right? Since the fall, because of your own responsibility. It's not to say that, because of the sins of Adam and Eve, now for some wicked reason we have, no, that we are the same people, right? The concept is that we psychophysically exist is the one to which we fell, and that we have within ourselves the capacity of countering through actual accomplishment, to actual aggrandizement. So through ways that could seem like, of course, sacrificial, and have to do with that also in a truly, say, psychological and symbolical sense, but also in a practical one, but that are not without earthly accomplishment, are not without works, are not without the necessity of structuring our own society in a way that basically tilts towards heaven, and so is able to become ever more cohesive and not destructive, right? And not fixated with your own personal failure, so that everything has to be dragged, all the potential that is in this world has to be say, terroristically say, described as a sort of degeneration, right? Let's try that. Let's try to see how much we can contribute for the good of the people. And there is always a double thread there. You can habituate a person to live better materially, which is not necessarily going to make this person better morally, but the idea is that you're transfigured in the flesh as much as, if you succeed at the end of the day, as much as thus the balance between the world of spirit and the one of matter, the former being indeed more important, but the latter being literally dead, right? So it's never about, let's say, matter in itself. It's about what you can train yourself, right, to accomplish spiritually while handling matter, not by leaving it there and starving yourself to death because you're just so frustrated about yourself that you want to get it over with the quickest, and not actually changing the world in a way, and actually, preaching this, but really wanting to steal money from the elite and killing them and doing similar things against one another, by the way. So you understand there is, even today, a very wide gap between the single most extremistic fringes and the mass of the people that seems to be stunned and in this sense, unintelligent, meaning that they don't really realize what's going on. They think that there is some sort of broader sense that things were either fixed themselves by themselves, which is some of a sin, or a passive subjectivism of some sort. And then the world that goes on as far as who is the strongest, who really has that faculty of command in a world ruled also by an emperor with essentially the Holy Ghost, the divine glory, supporting him with its wings, if he is fit for that. So there is also deeply ingrained at that point, different from today, that if something succeeded, it's not just a matter of payback or based on some sort of abstract morality. There is also a sense of accomplishment. There is also a sense of pride in actual wealth, in actual power. That's the reason why also these movements never quite really had much of a future, or at least they really risk to engulf the system. But of course, the system must be run through some leader, right? Through some authority, through some discipline, through some order. So this is where the usually utopistic, nonsense that you can appreciate still being today. You say, where's the limit? Except the direction that you're looking at is the wrong one, on purpose, because you don't really want anyone to really be more intelligent than the mob, because otherwise they wouldn't be mob anyway, and they would destroy the mob, which is exactly what happened to these movements, right? And you have to, of course, appreciate there the goodwill of these groups in accepting the Catholic authority, after all, right? Because with their, again, framing in the Catholic Church, there was the surpass of the fracture between the ecclesiastical hierarchies and the same religious movement. That had been a quite consistent one. Furthermore, the Humiliati, having thus been subtracted from the area of heterodoxy, right, committed themselves to the anti-heretical battle, right? This is also a very important aspect of the same, because while, say, there were some levels here of it. Say one is full-fledged, open, hostile, heretical doctrine, trying to take over the world, ideally, but some actual places, communities, and so on. And of course, there is never that full extreme, right? There was always some degree of orthodoxy everywhere. Again, all these, we've seen in the videos about medieval society in general, everything is intertwined. There are so many different universities living at every level, every entity, every group. There is no kind of central absolute state whatsoever, so everything overlaps at different levels, right? And so they have also to compromise ideologically, and that's of course what makes also the gray area. But there are some open heretical movements that are hunted down and that are in fact also disposed of effectively, from the bigger campaigns against the Albigensians to individual trials, etc. Then there is this world of heterodoxy. There's this world of, okay, we're leaning essentially towards those extremes because we believe that our particular Christian viewpoint presents us with quite specific questions that we can't at least solve by ourselves. There are also a lot of meeting points again with Catholicism. As I was saying, the main, there's no such thing like mainstream whatever, because everybody, even the least suspectable, are somehow sometimes owning incredibly incomprehensible beliefs given their position, their backgrounds, etc. It is a matter of weakness in many ways, but fundamentally, right? We can make leverage on the extremists. We can essentially point out that somebody has to do something, like today, like, oh my God, this thing going on is so terrible, so let's do something, and nothing happens. Let's say rethink what these guys are doing, which means very often actually taking sides with the opposite direction, even though you do not have the palest idea of what it means, or what are the implications at the levels, or the broader ones that they are, but also to the very last, at the bottom of the ladder. And then, of course, there is the formalization of this lifestyle under orthodoxy. This is the most important dimension of these movements. They are not just sort of beliefs, right? Or memes or flags on a profile, whatever. They are really true communities that live together with some rules that they essentially give to themselves, that in this sense causes some problem because they're not regulated by a third party, another source that says, here there is a problem theologically. Why are you doing this, right? And there you have to check with canon law, natural law. You need ecclesiastical authorities, lay authorities that watch over what you're doing. And at some point, if that is illegal, of course, that is going to be taken care of. And this means at some point even fighting against these communities. Not so frequently as one may think, except, of course, all these communities were somehow involved in some higher level of, political military struggle, and with this social turmoil within them, so that we're not talking, again, in a world where everything is fine, then just some guy thinks something gets, sent to the stake. This is not actually how things work. But then there is the acceptation, in fact, that within the ecclesiastical hierarchy, even a layman can essentially provide himself or herself, because this is also what pertains to many nuns, many sort of third orders that are that provide with the opportunity of living a bit in the world and in the in the monastic space, which to different degrees, at least, that again we're not talking about monasticism specifically now, but could vary. There was always a great debate, a review of the various orders. In fact, the creation of the Mendicant ones was technically the first time in which there was something different from a Benedictine rule, because up to that point, that's what in the West basically everybody thought to be, right? When you look at Cluny, when you look at Chartres, they were all thinking to be, say, that version of Benedictines, fundamentally. This was also a very different reality that was spreading fast in the city, where the exposure to wealth, sin, etc. was much greater. So these problems were felt much more, and the cities were famous also for their autonomy, their sense of independence. So it was even difficult to interfere in that space, especially in this context, when you realize, of course, that the cities of Lombardy had been backed by the papacy, even in this sort of more populistic dimension. Think about the Pataria, just to limit the imperial rule in the peninsula. And this, of course, had brought in part to this problems to go unchecked as well, but this also allowed the papacy to be financially free from that lay interference, which was one, say, of the aspects that these movements had originally, because they started from very far back in time. You can't even say that there was never a moment. This was the moment of the intensification of the same, right? But they had always been there in a sense. What the same heretical currents were essentially bringing up were the same heresies you could find, say, I don't know, in late antiquity. Then shrinking, early Middle Ages, high Middle Ages, this thing pop up again. But at this point, the church, as we've seen, had been developing a truly monarchic order, right? And under Innocent III, basically every Western realm was a vassal, right? Not namely of the Catholic Church, and as such, also the local authorities behaved. And again, the lay authorities, the kings, the princes, we were all fine with the idea of having greater control on social order, because these movements were inherently anti-institutional, anti-civilizational. They were essentially a fourth estate, extremistic, leftistic, terroristic world, right? That was largely, say, not doing much in practice, because that's the thing, mostly all talk and a few that. But in some cases, given that when a famine struck or when there was some war, etc., this could fuel big, say, riots, revolts, even, or more. So it was everybody's interest to, say, when you say in the government, to maintain things orderly, because it would have not been better for even the average person, not even for these very individuals, to live in a more disorderly world, right? But the anti-heretical commitment of these movements, in fact, shows how it was received fundamentally, the message, right? It's like today, fortunately, like this is why I have great faith in civilization after all, is that, while there are certain extremes in the same elite, for different reasons, right? There could be, now it's difficult to make a comparison in a time of when there is no such thing like a universal authority, and especially when the world doesn't quite revolve around that, so it's much more messed up. But the idea is that you can't fix that from within the same institution. You don't have to destroy the institution and maybe make, again, the civilization collapse in the process, or an enemy of yours take over or destroy everything you had basically accumulated after centuries of development, just because you think at this moment that it's bad that a person has that idea, right? The important is fundamentally the stability of the system. The important is maintaining the balance between the center and the fringe, so that they have to keep oppressing and provoking each other to the benefit of civilizational development, though, right? And so the majority of people fundamentally agrees. And what movements like the Humiliati did was basically saying, well, look, we are, and we will remain to some extent, heterodox, in a broader sense, even St. Francis, in his own way, was heterodox. He had to discipline his rule because the church said, look, there are things that do not work here. There are, I don't know, some mystics, think about, I don't know, Catherine from Siena, etc., that were, in many ways, figures that you could express some, some criticism of in general, because the ways, again, these groups lived were also quite, they were Christomimic ideally, but in a sense they were also very, let's say, debatable, especially as far as, I don't know, living literally without anything, right? They contested property. This is actually what I could immediately say in a more explicit way. They really were, right, largely. They had problems with owning, right? But once they got organized, the problem started immediately. Where do these people live? How do they eat? Like this very down-to-earth issues. And of course, they couldn't do anything but accepting to be framed within such space. And what actually happened in this regard is that, by the way, the houses of these new orders spread like crazy everywhere. I mean, the Humiliati were present in a wide range of areas, especially in northern Italy, very thickly. By the way, the order was abolished in 1571 because at that point it had become, let's say, obsolete. At least it was a completely different time in history. There was a need for, say, compaction within the same Catholic Church. After the Counter-Reformation, everything was somehow to have a meaning in a sense on the there and then. But this is exactly the point. In order to achieve that stability, they had to renounce some core elements of their, for example, anti-property ideas, because to a minimum they should have, yes, it belonged to the order, etc., but you still had to handle part of that, and so it was still accepting that there had to be a broader administration, hierarchy within the same system, and so on, because otherwise it's just, no, if you want to be intransigent about everything, well, okay, just keep living like an animal in the street, right? But it's not quite, I think, an intelligent or a humanly worth kind of behavior, right? One thing is experiencing that as a monastic experience, as also Christ in the desert did at some point, to elevate yourself, to have a, to expand your vision, to essentially clear some doubts from yourself, to load yourself in spiritual power that, of course, the world, as we can correlate to a degree, of course, we feel to be polluted, right, and sickened by. But the ultimate monastic purpose was always coming back to the world and leaving for a cause, for a purpose, right? The world cannot be eliminated, right? It could be if we were God ourselves, but this is why we need an institution like the church in order to catalyze that process, to realize what it is to have a balanced order that allows us to, say, reach, to develop our best, to fulfill our potential, to be in the conditions of just of security that help eventually daring more at some point and pushing forward and acquiring greater wisdom and exercising that power and see how it goes in terms of works Holy Ghost, which seems to be the entire point of civilization. If you study, the Bible itself or any other, they do not, none of them shy away from the concept that must be an achievement in this world. They can't be just abandoning it, right? It is about the greater truth that we must, however, be able to acquire, right? The Gospels are not actually at all discriminating against the earthly world as such, right? Because it's in there that our arena really is, right? Just there is another dimension that is more important, but that we can go through only through different veils that we have to discover in reality. So on earth, in our fallen condition, because there is no other way out of ourselves that we can transfigure the same, what these heresies instead were denying. They thought essentially it was enough to get rid of physicality altogether. And so committing a sin of basically suicide and also lack of just against the basics even of Genesis of reproduction, of regulamentation, of order, of discipline, of authoritative hierarchy. And this is, of course, a huge topic that I can't digress on just for today, because there is, again, who thinks the opposite, but with what actual results, and with what practical use, because tradition is passed down through civilization. It's not passed down through wishful thinking. You must go out there and do something in order to learn how true tradition is. It's not just a shortcut to say, okay, well, just think to obey these things, and then you don't even try how hard that is. So at that point, you could happen to deny anything, right? Even the support on which a Bible is written, assuming that is actually how does a Catholic really know that? And that's where, in fact, dualistic heresies that were technically not even Christian heresies, they were not Christianity altogether originally, promoted this idea. So it's remarkable in as much as there were surely some alternative beliefs behind this all that went that had been preserved, that had been part of a broader tradition in, say, previous centuries, previous millennium or before, but they had always been coexisting with a Catholic idea that had always repelled and persecuted this stuff, right? Many people don't understand this, but witchcraft was something that was already brought down, persecuted, and eradicated in Roman times. In any society really had that system. The Middle Ages were not even particularly into that compared to the modern era, right? Where it was actually a peak when the Catholic Church thought it was ridiculous to see in other countries, say even as late as the 18th century. Nobody in Rome thought that burning a woman for witchcraft in the 16th century was the best way to handle a problem that was fortunately dying out. It was based, in fact, on this chthonic deterministic sort of and they were materialistic even in the moment in which they in fact assessed this success of the others. And so even in the problem of getting rid of materialism, I've met people myself who thought that the stronger in the world is who has more money, who has more technology. Are you kidding me? And money and technology work by themselves, move by themselves. The world is basically get some money and some technology, and that's how it works. Haven't you realized what the entire history of mankind is about? And you are still the one who is craving the most for matter because you're poorer and you're envying those who have, and so you spit on that, but it has nothing to do with the reason why you're so unsuccessful. It is a reason of spiritual underdevelopment, and hardly a problem of matter, even when problem seems huge in that regard. And still, we are all facing a situation in which a living condition that doesn't matter how limited by that, it has the only way out our spiritual development, because apparently there's really no other, right? And how is the situation going to improve in any way if you don't try that and realize that everything civilization has made to make people living better is based on it, right? Nobody really understands that. But that's the degree of these contradictions, right? The fact that the Humiliati were won over by the church to even fight the heretics, presenting a similar face to their own, is incredibly powerful, because they were offering instead an orthodox way to the religious instances of some individuals and communities. But again, against the heretics and wearing their same clothes, literally. That is to say, living as poor volunteers for Christ, maintaining themselves with their own work. This had been a thing also that monks, generally speaking, had carried out on their own, and preaching and listening to the word of God, right? So a lifestyle that was to suggest the need of some more hardcore sort of proximity to Christ's suffering, right, than what most people would think about. And so these people felt satisfied adequately in front of sin, in front of the excess of material wealth, etc., being an injustice, as that word showed, at so many levels, that they were maintaining a balance, that they were maintaining the awareness of the sacred in their own hearts, and that this would gradually help these movements growing into a even sounder help to Catholicism. Setting this example for others, that is to say, showing that even that part of heterodoxy that was, in fact, slightly different, what remained close to the axis of orthodoxy, but was still, to some degree, acceptable in that regard. So your own interpretation, also of the Word of God, that touch effect of customization could give to it, of some sort of subjective, if there had been any of that need of sort of affirmation in your movement, or your story, your own past, etc. Right, but the Humiliati that had been such an important movement, integrated like this, was a huge deal in front of the entire world of heterodoxy, and especially of heresy. That could not be but a Catholic victory in front of movements that in fact were losing this entire chunks, and that had been quite pervasive. There were lots of people that were connected even with the Valdensians, or that remained heretical within the original Humiliati. But they disappeared, also to some degree, and while the order was maintained. So this was a huge deal, as just other groups were borderline heterodox, such as the Franciscans, and yet they made it in as well, and they started immediately as more directly under Papal authority, even though there were so many problems afterwards, but still, that there was a firm root, a firm, even in the same ways of disciplining these people, there was the example of those who had already experimented that evangelical pauperistic mission in the service of the church against the heretics, the Dominicans. I mean, the Franciscans were basically disciplined just the same way the Dominicans did, just they maintained this sort of more mystical bias as opposed to the theological one of the Dominicans, even though they both rose to have some of the most important doctors through the education of their members in the universities and so on in Europe at the time, but it's still an important difference. So the framing in official Catholicism of some pauperistic-evangelical movements, together with the, by the way, harshening of the anti-heretical repression was taking place in arms, contributed to distinguish neatly the two spaces, the orthodox and the heterodox one. This was a good outcome because it was about confronting people on the hard core of their beliefs and saying, do you truly believe this? To the death, right? Or not? And this is a choice that ask most people today about whatever they think about, I don't know, the world right now. And all the time they talk, they pause, they put themselves in a certain relation with certain political events or military events or whatever, actually pick them and force them to recognize that the overwhelming majority of the time, they do not know absolutely anything about that. But not even remotely. They never did, but they just want to seek attention for some reason. Until somebody should knock to their door and say, are you serious about that or not? Explain why. And it's only at that point that you can make deep your point of, okay, yes, I stand my ground, and you get martyrized because of that. Or you actually realign your beliefs, because after all, it's not much that somebody's threatening you, which, again, with the coercive power of the world in the 13th century, it's not that easy to do in the first place, even by universal authorities. And I actually think that most of what you thought was a very stupid idea, because you didn't know practically anything, if anything, because you really don't know anything about the topic in the first place. And it's even, like, most of the times a bad idea, because if you're aligned with that movement, this is the importance in the quality of beliefs. That one thing is, being from the side that complains about the problem exists, and so that you're owed allegedly something just because you exist as well, which skips completely. In fact, the most important thing is to say, what is that you have to do in order to fix the problem? Who is going to pay for that? And with which merit is this solution going to be pursued? And this is the difference between sticking to populism, the fourth estate, moral and cultural misery, and instead siding with civilization, with realizing that there must be an iron fist somewhere, and that this is not simply to crush the opponents, but it is first and foremost to defend the system and to make things work before anyone can even find themselves in the conditions of having a problem. This is what I think also today's people are fundamentally and dramatically ungrateful for at any level of their existence. Right? We have convinced people that they're owed something without merit. That everything should be considered equally. People's lives, people's opinions, which is fine as long as it is what it is in terms of opportunity and potential, but not in actual practice, which is a completely different realm of reality. And what happens because people do or don't do things, and this has an impact on the world, and then you must be judged on that basis. And the first part is just being a child, right? An adult actually with the brain of a child, because children are actually, especially in their own condition, as they are actually learning in order to be mature adults in that regard. So there is no excuse for adults, right, especially, right? So without, again, digressing on the nature of heresy in 13th century Europe, just know that that side was the first one, and that the church, the same empire, because they were actually cooperating, even when they were going at war against one another, there was still a sense that higher level participated in by also the other Christian monarchs, etc., was the one that everybody had together in order to make to fix things and make things work true. But why were councils held in the first place? Why were issues of Christendom scale proportion debate? Because everybody was to accept that rule to make things work better, having sorted out what solution would have been better, right? And this stems, like, even in terms of practice, that is there is no civilization that holds without things working, right? You can't fall into the conspiracy theory that everything, it's always the rich man, that it's the elite, is those terrible puppet masters behind the scenes. And if this was true, where would all the wealth, all the power, all the how would this hierarchy actually hold itself without a surrounding, without constantly making people poorer, weaker, etc.? The thing would collapse, if anything, right? And maybe that's also how it happens to some degree, but historically it didn't tend towards that, right? There were ups and downs in civilization, but there is no doubt that there was a general improvement that, yes, also passed through failure, passed through, let's say, putting patches and bringing to that issue of losing fundamentally a spiritual discipline, as far as realizing that not everything is a merely functionalistic race. It has to, everything must be rooted in a traditionally spiritual dimension in order to work in the first place. But what is that actually, in today's world in terms of quality of life, etc.? If not, in fact, from a moral point of view, that is going wrong. There is evidently a background that makes things work, and that we're not grateful enough for, but that we still, and we would like to tear down crazily just to be able to say what, and so that everybody is poor, so that there are no differences, because this is exactly what the Pauperistic-Evangelic movements in their radical stance did really believe in. And this is part of, in fact, it's also an anti-clerical belief, because the church must be organized hierarchically, right? The entire sense of divine kingship is just re-expressed in Christendom. It's an illusion to pretend that there is a merely pauperistic message in the Gospels per se, right? That's just a humanly, say, a divinely attainable extreme that humans can't quite reach, because they are in fact too stuck to certain material dimension that must serve them to some purpose. Otherwise, what's the purpose of redemption? Right? How can somebody grow in order to be a responsible father, for example? Or just individual? But there is literally a ladder. There is a biological cycle there. You cannot, say, unsee. So the Humiliati integration mostly triggered a very interesting phenomenon, that is to say, harshening, right, the extremism and the radicalism of the heretical groups, because they realized they were going under, they were desperate, and so they had to resort to all the kind of bestiality in order to pretend that they had a relevance while their system was falling apart. Especially those groups that contested the growing political and juridical power of the papacy took up ever more radical positions from a doctrinal point of view, and to the support of their refusal of the Roman hierarchy, even when they actually copied it to make it a parallel one when they were, in fact, the most powerful, right? When they were the weaker, they simply could not afford it, and so they were also less dangerous. But in this sense, also coping with the problem, competing with the new, say, their Catholic homologues through new forms of reciprocal support and solidarity. This is obvious because civilization was expanding anyway, and so in order to be competitive, they had to regulate themselves in a civilized fashion, and this also obliged them to reconsider some ideas, because one thing is, yeah, you can be a radical, but then what are you actually going to do about this? Well, that's what, for example, the Cathars responded, creating again a parallel system that was aiming at making Occitania escaping French pressure from the north, and with such also the full, Catholic obedience, and being supported, by the way, by Catholic powers like the Crown of Aragon, that in fact was even intervening in failing, so by the way, in support of the Cathars in southwestern France. And that evidently was showing reality, right? Big systems, like today, you see it this very days, there are established powers that are somehow vicious or, untrustworthy and quite not fitting the standards of a full civilization by Western standards, that support, however, much more radically and terroristically fringe pawns that have basically nothing to do with, that would be immediately taken away were they living in that power. But that constitute again an interesting pawn or leverage to employ for whichever purpose of personal, that political aggrandizement and not much else. And at this point, the papacy of Innocent III was being characterized from one side by the harshening of the anti-clerical clash, and on the other by a marked attention to, place within the ecclesiastical order. These movements that had organized themselves spontaneously, institutionalizing these heterogeneous experiences that were gradually manifesting in Christianity according to a plan, a purpose that tended to basically take them back within, in fact, the context, the already consolidated monastic and canonical currents. In other words, when you look at the dynamic of this movement, it was either you're, again, in or out, right? And if you were in, you would just have the benefits of already established communities accepted and recognized by the Catholic Church. If you were against the same, you would at best be marginalized and always watched over, and at worst put down, right? Also because you had to respond of what you were actually preaching and what you were publicly called to defend. This is also how, the Mendicant orders, as we'll see now, were born, because literally within the same Pauperistic-Evangelical movements, there were intense conflicts, right? Debates, issues going on, because they met publicly. Everything was mostly at this level of society, also oral, right? There wasn't much of literacy, yet, right, the church was making this dramatic effort of fulfilling, the juridical regulation of this enormous system that the Papal monarchy was becoming through canon law, all what also the lay world could there exchange with one another. There were intense debates also at that level. But this was the point, right? There was somebody that could call on this guy and say publicly, you're a liar. You will go to hell because what you're saying is wrong, and I'll prove it to you. This is how the Dominicans basically began to operate, and crossing places like that. They moved, and these communities were scattered pretty far away places. Sometimes that's also why they were very difficult to control, because even Saint Francis' life were, again, Franciscan communities spreading as far as England or Germany, that when Francis was, again, still alive and regulating themselves without even at that point having the immediate possibility of asking Francis, that naturally was writing a rule, but that didn't have just per se the means to have this enforced. And so, with problems arising incredibly fast, that's why these movements were so important to check, to regulate, to discipline, to normalize, because you couldn't quite easily control it. It would be like this, like during the Protestant Reformation, with a printing machine, with the idea that still the world was much more corroded by that time, and so there were different preconditions at that point. But the work that the Church carried out at this point, in the 13th century, was in the 12th, was enormous in further regulation and gradual statalization of control within the limits of, again, a world that didn't really quite have consolidated states in the way we intend, but cooperating that same level with national monarchies, even the empire, etc., to maintain an orthodoxy. The reason why eventually the Catholic Church won this struggle is that it was essentially beating the heretics with their own weapons. Right? If people shout, saying a lot of stupid things and whatever, the only way, call them out, expose them, prove what that is right, was you're sort of participating into that. You're letting these people to monopolize space. You're not really showing the world that all what these crazies say all around you is nonsense, largely. And even when there is a problem, a concrete problem behind it, doesn't mean that these people, by suffering because of it, know better what the solution is. Right? There is again, a level of confusion, of disorientation that can be corrected only by people who have a more comprehensive view. Because at the end of the day, people don't like to make sacrifices, and that's also where it gets down to, in Christian terms. You must sacrifice instead if you want to see anything accomplished. And this should be constant. So even that, this is why the Pauperistic-Evangelical movements were also equipped with this preciously, with the pre-existing experience of poverty, of pilgrimage, of sort of marginal need of self-organization, because they had already coped with some of the problems they were lamenting, and there was no doubt that what the Church was offering was a level of stability for experimenting that lifestyle that could, at that point, bring to an end that sort of anxiety, existentially and beyond, that these individuals had. Imagine that, right? What's the option in a world torn apart by war and injustice and terrible things and really appalling living conditions, when you're able to constitute a community and having a higher power saying, look, we will accept you, we will give you even more to pursue that, as long as you accept, of course, at the end of the day, the Catholic doctrine that existed even before Christianity, what we call as such. So it's there a reaffirmation through the Roman Church of a true traditional order that is one of the major cornerstones, in fact, of Western civilization in medieval times. And we couldn't be speaking of Western civilization otherwise at that point in history. This, indeed, in my opinion, is one of the most underrated aspects of, just the... It's not even the investiture, say, like the Gregorian reforms. It's what happened later, after Worms 1122. It's, okay, you got it. Now what do you do with that papal monarchy? And that's what they managed to do. They managed to create an homogeneous order over the entire Western Christendom that was expanding even further, politically and territorially, and to discipline it entirely in a world that doesn't have that super state that not even the empire can remotely come close to. So this was possible because, of course, Europeans were able to provide with that moral support to the papacy that it had deserved, right? And there was no other way to do it, right? If there were no coercive means, like the papacy was not a military superpower. Of course, it was supported by the armed, say the Armstrong of the lay authority, but also did give power to lay authority. The majority of people, and not even in fact the extremistic sort of exponential moral drive of the heretics, were able to tackle this order, because it would bring nowhere sensible, right? That's how the Mendicant orders were born. I made a video that was exactly about this. That is to say, the integration of the Mendicant of the Pauperistic-Evangelical movements in the Roman Church. This is one of my very first videos back in the day, and obviously we will come back on these topics. And notoriously, these orders were called as Mendicants because they drew their resources, their material ones, almost exclusively from the alms, right, the offers of the faithful, rather than from the revenues deriving from the exploitation of the landed property and the exercise of seigneurial rights, as bishoprics, as abbeys, as monasteries did, right? And we've seen it quite often in many circumstances. There is a playlist made properly about medieval bishops that tells you what their power was about, and against which, in fact, these movements had a bit been born critically towards, because they said, but is that what the secular clergy should be about? Is this how the church should be ordered, right? Because that's a very different level from the lay power that they held. It was not about them having power that was much the problem in itself, because you're always going to have, in spite of the fact that the church does not belong to any earthly power, but to God, a degree of superimposition, just like in the gospel. It says, render unto Caesar, but it doesn't mean, like, don't consider Caesar, or don't think that you live in the world under Caesar, or there is none of that, right? That's just an absolute warning in saying, remember that God is all you need, right? So what happens on earth is obviously a product of your fall, right? And Christ is the Lord. You aren't, but you are in his own image, and therefore you have a potential to elevate also your earthly status, and so your earthly authority to the heavenly standard, which is what that really gets down to. So the question was there how to do so, and so everything is humanly debatable as far as it's human by definition, but this church managed to convince, after all, the masses, without launching a crusade against every person that disagreed, that after all, how the world worked was not that bad compared to what instead these other movements that they didn't even have a truly unitary plan or capacity, right? They could again win over local laymen, that would remain even Catholic, just exploit them just to get more, I don't know, political autonomy, etc. to rule. That's it. Like, there must be someone who does that. This was going on really from a long time. The empire had been Christian since, the first centuries, and the recognition of earthly authority is not something just trivially considerable in a Christian fashion. So this first institutional novelty of the orders that were different from the Benedictine one by rule, right? And so differently from what happened for the older monasteries and canons, systemically detracted the order of recent constitution from, in fact, even the competition with others lay centers of power. This was very important for the church as well, because the general tendency of eventually what the Mendicant orders came to work like was also to oppose the same bishops at a point. I mean, the church used, for example, in the cities where the diocese was, the Mendicants to win over that part of the population and mitigate, for example, episcopal power when this was really corrupt, for example, was not responding to the church because, say, would side with the emperor in the investiture issue, which was an enormous issue that fundamentally revolved, even if at a different political and social level, basically around the same problem. Is to say, what's the limit of the papal earthly power, and one just of the council of the bishops, and which the one of the emperor in relation with the church in the ecclesiastical hierarchy. All right. So the papacy proved that the pauperistic-evangelic movements could be normalized in this mendicant orders, and essentially opening the way for lots of people that would immediately choose that option once that the church saw their say concerns understood to some degree. So the poor, right? This was a core idea. This is something that came straight from the. Again, there were some, pauperistic movements from the very beginning of Christendom. You can argue that there is a, of course, an important role that poverty plays in Christomimicism and so on. No doubt, right? The poor were identified with this mendicant orders and became a synonym of that. And so, from the other side, the heretical one, nobody could quite say, well, we are the only ones to do that, right? So there wasn't just the the secular hierarchy of the church being there as the authority, and the rest of Christians being just cut out, but there were these same entities and orders now within the same Catholic Church where you could enter. You could have this sort of, again, half-life of, say, a bit in the world and a bit in these groups. And this was very important for the comfort that those existential troubles of the time were giving people, really. And the beauty of it, in a sense, is that they were different from one another as well. There were different characteristics, right? Just as much, even the saints that founded them, etc., had different inclinations. Again, the Franciscans were more, the most, actually, about this poverty. The Humiliati were similar to a degree, of course, that they all had different, again, rules. Right, and that's why they also flourished a bit in this time of peak of, say, Western expansion. And eventually even some of them declined because, generally speaking, it was late medieval times a monastic decline in general. But at this point, right, the load that the Western world was carrying, together with this incredible impulse to expansion, was creating tensions within the same system that were partly vented, absorbed, solved through these movements, right? And so I think this is to be extremely appreciated. The various experiences from which these orders originated were different. We will see it better in another video discussing, of course, the various orders. There is really a lot to say about the preachers. The entire, the problems kept occurring, as we have seen, even after they were integrated in the Catholic Church, but that were eventually solved, and also with great benefit as far as the the civilizational output of Western Christendom was concerned. We will see these things at other point. However, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.